What's going on, and everybody? Welcome to our first edition of Zoom Sports Talk. We're probably going to have a better name coming in a little bit, but for us to slowly but surely get accustomed to this quarantine and still give you guys the sports content that you guys need and want, we're going to deliver, and we're going to try to do the best that we can. So for this first one, I'm Wilnir Louis, and I have alongside me, even though they're not really alongside me, Michael Daly and Heaven Hill for this edition. Guys, how are you feeling?
Feeling good. It's good to talk about sports. I feel like for so long it's been talking about other things going on in the world, but to be with you guys, it's good to be here.
Yeah, this is tremendous. I always love being on Pirate Primetime from the stands. So to be back in a setting similar to that, although we're not at WSOU, it's a great feeling.
Listen, of course, there is actually a decent amount of stuff that we could talk about with Seton Hall, and I guess we could start with that. So Seton Hall finished out their roster. They have a couple of new additions. Of course, the big one, Bryce Aiken from Harvard, the grad transfer, and a couple of freshmen too. And honestly, this Seton Hall team could really make some noise in the Big East if those pieces start coming together.
When you see teams like Villanova every year, they're adding a few 4 stars as well as 5 stars. It makes things a little bit harder for all the other schools. And when the season officially ended and names like Miles Powell, Quincy McKnight, they went out the door, everyone was wondering what's next year going to look like. But I think when Bryce Aiken came in, there was a bit of a sigh of relief because now you have a guy who can really handle the point. He can run it. You saw what he could do at Harvard. He did very well there. And the fact that now, as a grad transfer, he has a lot of experience, and he's coming to a place that he's comfortable at. He's a Jersey kid. He's used to here. He even said that he probably made a mistake not coming here in the first place. So now that he's here finally, I think it's good. And then obviously with Jeff Van Gandu coming, being the final spot for Seton Hall, I think what that does is it's great because it has this pipeline in North America. You saw with Tyrese Samuel, he went to the same school that Jeff Van Gandu went, and now Jeff Van Gandu is at Seton Hall. I think it's great for the Pirates.
Yeah, I think the last couple of moves that the Pirates made are really going to, impact the season for sure. I mean, we saw what Bryce Aiken could do, particularly his junior year at Harvard. I think that was probably one of the best offensive seasons in the Ivy League. I mean, he was phenomenal, scoring from every level while being a great facilitator. Of course, his stats weren't to the level of the great Miles Powell, but Bryce Aiken on that stage, he proved he could lead a successful program, and he showed he could be, the top point guard when it comes to a contending team. So you put him from the Ivy League to the Big East, of course, an increase in difficulty, but you'd have to assume the players around him this time around are better as well. I mean, yes, there is a ton of roster overturn. You had the 4 seniors, then you had a couple players from Seton Hall's roster last season transfer out, but there's still a couple quality pieces. You still have Sandro Mamukelashvili, you still have Jared Roden. Those are really big guys that showed throughout last season that they can be positive contributors and really help this team get to the top tier of the Big East. Now, there will be some drop-off, of course, when you're losing Big East Defensive Player of the Year, Big East Player of the Year. I mean, these are top-notch players that went out the door, but hopefully with some natural development from Roden, Mamu stepping into that top-tier role, Bryce Aiken continuing his facilitating ways, and then, of course, the new recruits, Jahari Long and Dominguez Stevens. Hopefully this team won't fall too far from the top 3 of the Big East.
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at the players that they're bringing in. Of course, we're talking about Bryce Aiken, and he has a lot of experience. Even though last year was great for him, he dealt with a lot of injuries last year. So you kind of wonder if he gets healthy or if he's 100% and he's able to play throughout the whole season, what that really is going to mean for Seton Hall. And, of course, you have the player from Canisius, you have to call Molson, and he sat out last year. He was able to learn from Kevin Willard and learn from even Miles Powell and Quincy McKnight, and he's a player that honestly resembles a lot of Quincy McKnight's play. He is a scorer. He can get to the basket, and Quincy McKnight, when he was at Sacred Heart, that's what he was doing. He was a scoring player, but then came to Seton Hall and started facilitating the ball a little bit more, but is also known for his defense. And Takal Molson has that same frame and that same energy to the point where he could play that tenacious defense, where he could get into a guard's face and really disrupt them, get steals, and even just make it a little bit difficult for them. And then, of course, you talked about the freshmen that's coming in, Dominguez Stevens, Jahari Long, and Jeff Ngandu, and you think they might not get as much minutes. I think Jeff probably get a little bit more minutes just because he's a bigger player, and Seton Hall needs that depth in that front court. But, you look at those two main transfers, and, of course, they picked up Trey Jackson as well. So, and Trey Jackson not going to be able to play the first year due to transfer rules unless a waiver comes out later on this year. But with those two players at least coming in, Bryce Aiken and Takal Molson now being able to play, this Seton Hall team, like you said, could possibly still make a battle for that top 3, top 4 spot in the Big East, especially even with UConn coming in.
What helps Seton Hall is that they have a lot of depth and they also have a lot of experience. A player that, even though obviously he's not new, I think will really come into his own is Jared Rhoden. Looking ahead to this upcoming season, most people say Sandro Mamukelashvili is going to be the leader, which I don't doubt. But if I was projecting and looking ahead as to who I think will be the best player next year, you guys might disagree, but I think it's Rhoden. I just like the way he has been able to gradually build from freshman to sophomore year. Sophomore year, he averaged 9.1 points per game. He looked impressive. Now, before Sandro went down with that injury, he was averaging 10.1 points per game, which is definitely impressive. But I just think the way Jared Rhoden has been able to step up this year, I think that's going to help them. And also what it does is it helps these younger guys. It helps the Dominguez Stevens. It helps Jeff Ngandu. It helps people like that who are new and trying to adjust. And in a way, it kind of forms this brotherhood. And I think it's healthy competition. Everyone's fighting for time to play, time to get onto the court. When you have veterans like that eating most of the minutes, it forces these younger guys, like anyone pretty much that's new to the team, Dominguez Stevens, I mentioned, it forces them to work harder because you also have a guy like Miles Kale. Miles Kale last year, he had moments where he was forced to sit on the bench. In his senior year, he doesn't want that to happen, especially if he wants to make it to the NBA. So he'll be working his hardest to make sure that he can get as much playing time as possible while also helping the younger guys out.
Without question. I mean, when you look at what the rest of the Big East teams lost, Tyshawn Alexander going to the draft or St. John's losing out on, Mustafa Heron or whoever else. And then Villanova, they kept most of their team. I mean, this Seton Hall team is extremely talented. Like I mentioned, although we did lose out on some really big name players, the guys you just named, Takal Molson, Jared Rhoden, Miles Kale. I mean, yes, Takal Molson did it at Canisius. Sure, that's at a small level. But the numbers he put up, I mean, winning Rookie of the Year in the conference and then improving, taking on a bigger role and increasing almost all of his stats outside of, I believe it was assists. I think, like Will said, after, sitting on the sideline, having a year now to watch and develop and witness how, witness how Seton Hall system works and how, Quincy McKnight, especially like Will said, he was a scoring guard at Sacred Heart. And then, over his Seton Hall career, turned into more of a reliable facilitator that was also excellent on the defensive end and could get buckets when he needs to. Witnessing someone like that in that position, I think that'll help Molson tremendously. He's now been able to work and get prime teaching from one of the best coaches in the nation, Kevin Willard, all the position coaches at Seton Hall. I think he'll be able to step up into a huge role. Jared Rhoden, when Sandro Mamukelashvili was out for weeks with a broken wrist, it was Rhoden that entered the starting lineup. And he exceeded all of our expectations, in my opinion. Just going out there, always being willing to hustle and grind for every opportunity. His rebounding ability at his size is really top notch. One of the better rebounding wings in the conference. Always working hard. Like Daly said, I think he could potentially be that next big guy for the Seton Hall basketball program. Just showing such camaraderie between him and Miles Powell. It was clear that Powell looked to Roden like a younger brother. So now you have all that development, all that learning, teaching experience going to Roden. And then lastly, like you said, Daly, Kale, after a disappointing season last year, he had a great sophomore season where he averaged 10 points per game and shot 38% from three, shot 41% from three in conference play, showed really top-notch skills. And then his junior season came, and he fell off the grid outside of a couple of games, the first 2 games of conference play, I believe. So we've seen what he can do, in certain situations. Last year, he became a really good defensive player. If he can bring his offensive production from his sophomore season with the defensive play he showed last year, this could be a make or break year for him. I think he'll stand out. So you've got a core group of guys with the Roden, Mamu, Kale, and Molson. Then you have, other reliable guys off the bench, Shavar Reynolds, Ike Obiagu, Tyree Samuel, who had some flashes last season. We barely mentioned him, but I think he can play really well. And then the freshmen. So who knows? This team, in my opinion, I think they can compete, at the same level that they did last year. Do I think they'll produce the same amount of wins as last year? No, because, of course, it's going to be nearly impossible to replace Miles Powell's production. But I think this team will definitely be in the top half of the Big East, if not the top 3, right there with Creighton and Villanova. So it'll be an interesting year for sure.
Yeah, it definitely will be interesting, but we're going to have all the time in the world over the summer to talk about the Seton Hall men's team. Let's transition a little bit to the Seton Hall women's team, and they picked up 2 transfers as well. On top of that, 4 freshmen signing on their roster. And this is a team that is only graduating 3 seniors in Shadeen Samuels, Alexis Lewis, and Barbara Johnson, as well as 1 player transferring out for the Seton Hall women's team. And again, this was a team that was pretty dominant in the Big East. Now, conference-wise and conference record, you would have wished that they would have been a little bit better, a little bit at the higher portions of the standings. But you look at the Big East tournament, and they were going blow for blow for not against not only a top Big East team, but a team that's known nationally in DePaul. And they went down to the wire and just a couple of shots missed for the Seton Hall women's team, and they came away with the loss. But this team, again, UConn coming in, and we all know the powerhouse that UConn is, especially in women's basketball. But I think this Seton Hall team is still a team that could be, pretty good, top half of the Big East come the basketball season next year.
What was so frustrating about everything being shut down with the coronavirus, not only did we miss out on seeing what the men's team could have done, but the women's team, they were trending in the right direction. They went wire to wire with DePaul in the Women's Big East tournament. I personally think, had the WNIT happened, I think they could have made a run. I really think they could have gone deep. Now, I don't know how far necessarily they would, but I think the Pirates could have won a few games in the WNIT. And looking at next year, when you see that they lose Alexis Lewis as well as Shadeen Samuels, you think, oh, wow, this team, they're going to be in rough shape. But that's not the case. I like the way their guard play has been able to step up this season, and I think it will be tremendous for next season. You have 2 players in Maya Jackson as well as Lauren Park Lane that will step up, and they'll be the leaders on this team, obviously with Desiree Elmore. And then you mentioned, Wilnir, the transfers. Playing will be difficult, especially if they have to sit out. It'll be a year in which they won't be able to play. But the thing is, if they are able to play, playing time will be tough because you have players like that. But also, they have 2 great sophomores to be learning from in Maya Jackson as well as Lauren Park Lane. I just love the way the two of them are able to attack the rim. Are they the biggest guards in the world? No, they're not. But their speed and their tenacity makes up for their lack of size, so to speak. And honestly, this team last year, they were 11-7 in conference play. If a few games went a different way, we're looking at a team that's 15-3 in conference play. I personally think there was a few games that they easily could have won that they didn't. Now, my biggest question for this year, a team that has given them a problem, and this is leaving out UConn, St. John's. Can they get over the hump of St. John's? Joe Tartamella is a phenomenal coach. I personally think this is the year that Seton Hall can finally get distance from St. John's, because it seems like every single year in the middle of the pack in the Big East, it's Seton Hall, St. John's. Can the Pirates get away from the Red Storm? We'll see.
It was interesting you mentioned that St. John's game, Daly, because Will and I, we were on the road game. Excuse me. We were on the road game at St. John's last year, and it was wow. I mean, I'm at a loss for words, because it seemed as if the Lady Pirates were in control for sheesh.
You're
Oh my
thinking about
goodness.
the little kid at St. John's, huh?
Man, nah. We're not gonna give him the attention he wants.
We already
We're
did.
we're gonna focus on the
Yeah, you
topic
just
at
name
hand.
dropped them.
But it was basically the Lady Pirates were in control for much of the game, and then Correa for the Red Storm, she just turned into a supernova and was just raining threes left and right. And out of nowhere, St. John's pulled off just a wild comeback victory. So, like you said, when it comes to the middle of the pack teams in the Big East, it's always those two, and it's always some tough battles between them. But this team last year, they had to deal with a little bit. You know, Fumi Funes, she was out for much of the season until she came back, later in the year. Shadeen Samuels missed some time with injury. And, of course, the learning curve for the freshmen that you mentioned, Daly, Maya Jackson and Lauren Park Lane. How would they be able to adjust going from high school basketball level to, a D1 basketball level? Obviously, a tough adjustment for anyone. And those two were in the starting lineups, almost nightly. So interesting to see how they would prevail. And Maya Jackson, I think she shocked a lot of people last season, going out, averaging double-digit points per game, 40% from the field. And in her first year as a player, had some huge performances. She played phenomenally. And then Lauren Park Lane showing that she can, be in that lead facilitating role despite her size. I think that was great to see, and I think she'll get even better. Now, you look at some games last year, this team really competed, and they could have went either way. I mean, the close game at Lehigh, the close home game against Princeton, they were playing tough against UConn when they visited Walsh Gym in the first half, before things fell apart down the stretch. So this is a team that, if a couple games went either way, they could have been in much better standing. So, like you said, Daly, they were trending upwards. If the WNIT happened, they most likely would have gotten in. And who knows? We've seen what this team can do. They possibly could have made a run. But I think when you look at how they performed last season against DePaul, against Marquette, against UConn, yes, they are losing Shadeen Samuels, one of the best players in Seton Hall women's basketball history. They are losing Alexis Lewis, who was a phenomenal transfer last season and an absolute bucket. But I think the core players that remain, Desiree Elmore, Maya Jackson, Lauren Park Lane, I think they can really contribute and keep this team at least in the top four of the Big East, when you add in UConn, the powerhouse that they are. Now, looking at the transfers, Cortesia Dean and Maya Bembry, if they can play, Dean, you're averaging someone who averaged, you're adding someone who averaged over 19 points per game, albeit, at a JUCO setting, but 19 points per game is impressive anywhere. You instantly add that to the lineup and to the rotation, and she's shown what she can do. I think that'll be a great addition. And then Maya Bembry, although she didn't play much at Penn State, I think she could easily contribute to the team as well. So it's going to be an interesting season. Of course, maybe the team gets worse with the departure of Shadeen and Alexis Lewis. It'll be a learning curve. But from what we've seen last season and from how this team is willing and able to compete against virtually anyone, including some of the best teams in the Big East, I think this team could break out and challenge for a top 3 seed.
Yeah, and again, you talked about those two transfers, Dean as well as Bembry, and then of course the incoming freshman for the Seton Hall Women's Pirates, McKenna Minter, Brittany Range, Skylar Threadwell, and Amari Wright. So it'll be a couple of new faces for the Seton Hall women's team, and again, we have a whole summer to talk about Seton Hall women's basketball. So let's transition into something that I'm pretty sure has been keeping sports fans entertained all around the nation and even all around the globe. Of course, Michael Jordan's documentary, The Last Dance, a 10-part docuseries that was on ESPN every Sunday. And again, it came at a perfect time because of the lack of live sports that has been going on due to the situations that has been happening around the country. And with this docuseries going through Michael Jordan's time at the Bulls, again, for a lot of younger people, because uh, you always hear the back and forth between, oh, is Michael Jordan better than LeBron, or is LeBron better than Michael Jordan? And from what I've usually seen is that you see a lot of people who grew up in that era where Michael Jordan was playing and was able to watch Michael Jordan play. They kind of had a better understanding, or at least they were able to witness Michael Jordan play. And a lot of newer kids our age, we really didn't see that. So going outside of that debate between LeBron and Michael Jordan, because we can talk about that later if you want, but just to go into the docuseries and how they're able to present Michael Jordan during his time at the Bulls, I thought that it was amazing across the board, situation that we're in or not.
Here's the thing. This is one thing that I picked up from this documentary, which went unsaid. A lot of people need to put some respect on Jerry Krause's name. Look, I get it. In the first few episodes, he was painted as the villain, and he did not help himself with the things he was saying and the way he was acting. Things were definitely shifted as if he was the bad guy, and I get it. But look at the man's track record. Look at all of the great things he was able to do. Look, it's one thing to talk about how great Michael Jordan was, which he is. I personally think Michael Jordan's the greatest of all time, but that, like you said, Wilnir, that's another topic for another time. But the biggest takeaway for me in this documentary was how great Jerry Krause was. Look at all of the personnel he was able to bring in. Doug Collins, who is a very underrated coach in the NBA. Look at the things he was able to do with the Philadelphia 76ers in the last decade. Obviously, Phil Jackson. Tex Winter, a great assistant coach that he was able to bring in. And then all of the trades he was able to make. He didn't draft Michael Jordan, but he helped with kind of bringing a nucleus around him. When we talk about the greatest GMs in the history of the game, we don't talk about him. We talk about guys like Pat Riley, R.C. Buford, as well as Jerry Colangelo, but his name isn't brought up. It should be. And I think his relationship hurt that. But look at all the people he was able to bring in. And another name that stood out to me during this whole thing, who really was a character, but I think people forget how great he was Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman was really the glue that held the Bulls together in the 90s. Without him, I don't think they are as good as they were defensively. He was a great on-ball defender, and obviously with the rebounding, that doesn't even have to be talked about, otherworldly. But the way the Bulls were so well-rounded, I think doesn't get talked about as much because everyone talks about Jordan Pippen. But they were much more than that. They needed those role players. They needed the Bill Wenningtons. They needed the Steve Kerrs. They even needed, the Judd Bushlers. They needed guys like that to really fill out the roster, and you saw that during the Last Dance.
Yeah, I in my opinion, that's got to be right there with OJ Made in America for one of the best sports-related docuseries I've ever watched. It was just from start to finish, really cohesive and complete. And of course, you're gonna have the people on Twitter like, oh, this is a commercial and this is a puff piece for Michael Jordan. The man doesn't need a puff piece. We're talking about the greatest basketball player to ever do it, one of the greatest, athletes to ever do it. he doesn't need anything to boost his reputation or pass on any agendas. I mean, the guy's been dominating, since the 80s, and he's a worldwide icon. But I really enjoyed how it was, and I saw a few people, they weren't a fan of this, how the timeline would jump, from season to season and past, years. But I really liked how they started out, how he was just a rural kid and he grinded his way into being, one of the best ever, if not the best ever, going from his humble beginnings, to him becoming a star in North Carolina. And then they showed his entire career, the ups, the downs, and they touched on a few, interesting and important moments. And it wasn't just about Jordan, like Daly said, the team was well-rounded and the doc was well-rounded. I mean, spending time to really get to know things about Phil Jackson, I didn't even know. I didn't know he coached in Puerto Rico. I was completely unaware of that. And, Steve Kerr and the situation with his dad, that was foreign to me. Scottie Pippen being one of many siblings, and that being one of the reasons why he took the contract he did. I didn't know that. Of course, I heard stories of Dennis Rodman and everything wild that he did, but it's to see all of that now and really to be able to take it in and analyze it from a completely different setting. It's phenomenal. The doc, it wasn't meant to convince to you that Jordan was one of the best players ever. His body of work speaks for itself. But I think the doc was really interesting and really important, and it showed how the NBA has grown, off the strength of one team, from the 80s to the 90s. They were the team of the NBA. And it was phenomenal. It touched on his rivals throughout the years, the Knicks and the Pistons, the Celtics. It was fantastic. The soundtrack was fantastic. Definitely one of the most anticipated docuseries that, we're ever going to get and we're ever going to see. A really big fan of it, and I'm probably going to rewatch it at some point this week just because.
Yeah, you guys are touching on it. Like, it was promoted a little bit in terms of it being a Michael Jordan documentary, but like you said, it was well rounded. I mean, you had an episode about Dennis Rodman, you had pieces about Steve Kerr, you had pieces about Scottie Pippen and Krause and all of them. And I thought, that's the reason why the timeline jumped so much, is because, for example, because this is, a little bit more fresher in my mind, but you talked about Steve Kerr, and then they had that person asked the question like, "Oh, do you ever talk about your fathers?" And then, Steve Kerr said no, and then the timeline jumped back to when Steve Kerr was, younger, and then talked about his time with his father in that situation. So I thought the way that the timeline jumped around, because a lot of people are, I guess, used to everything being sequential, but in the way that the timeline jumped around, it was, they brought up a significant moment. Let's jump back and figure out what happened in that moment. And again, I thought that the docuseries was well done, but the one thing that I did not know as much, and I feel like we didn't talk about this as much, is the way Michael Jordan actually led his teams. And it was interesting because you don't see that type of leadership now, because Michael Jordan was somebody who hounded everybody. And you talk about the rivals that he had, a lot of those rivals kind of came up with just somebody looking at him the wrong way. But on top of that too, when he had to be on top of his team, he would be on top of them in, I guess, what society would call now a diminishing way. So does that personality that got brought up with Michael Jordan kind of hounding his teammates, kind of, talking bad about a couple of teammates, almost getting in fights and stuff like that, does that hurt how we view Michael Jordan?
I don't think it does, because when it comes to personality-wise, a lot of people always have not great things to say about Michael Jordan. And that's the thing too. when you're comparing Michael Jordan with LeBron James, a lot of people sometimes they say, oh, well, LeBron's the nicer guy. We've heard a lot of stories about who Michael Jordan is. But for me, it doesn't change who he was as a player. He's the greatest of all time. And I think in order for him to be the greatest, he had to push his teammates the way he did. And he played with his heart on his sleeve. Even in the documentary, he got emotional. He had to take a break. That just shows how much he cared about being a leader, to the fact where 20 years removed from that situation, he's shedding a tear because it meant that much to him, and it still does at that time. But that just goes to show how much he meant to the Chicago Bulls, and none of that should be taken away. Now, look, a lot of his teammates said, yeah, he was a jerk. He was not the nicest guy to be around. At times, he was tough to be around because he was so cutthroat. But that's what made him great. Look at the other greats. I don't think there's a single player that is – well, Michael's a little different. But if you talk about the Mount Rushmore, a name that comes to mind is Kobe Bryant. Kobe, even though a lot of what he did kind of mirrored Michael Jordan, he was very similar. He was very cutthroat to Michael Jordan. Most recently, Jeremy Lin was talking about in 2015 during the trade deadline, Kobe Bryant healing up his shoulder, came back into practice, and they're like, Kobe, why are you here? And long story short, he said, I just want to say goodbye to you bums. To me, that's something that Michael Jordan would say. And yes, people should take that personally because it is something like that is tough to hear from a player like Jordan or Bryant. But that's kind of expected from those guys because they're win at all costs. If you're not with them, you're against them. So they have to do everything in their willpower to win. And Michael Jordan did just that.
Yeah, I don't think him being such a polarizing player and treating his teammates like that, I don't think it hurts his legacy or how we look at him in any way. I feel like, when it came down to it, he did what he had to do in order to get the very best and in order to get results out of his team. I mean, you look at his relationship with Scott Burrell and how and how that was portrayed throughout the series. It looked like he was Scott Burrell's worst nightmare, on multiple occasions. But an article that I read a couple of days ago, it talked about how I believe it was Burrell saying that, MJ treating him like that is what made him, the player that he was, and how he still talks to MJ and how he looks at him as a role model and as a guiding light. And you have to remember, Michael Jordan wasn't just this big tyrant and it was only him in that locker room. Scottie Pippen was there, as the yin to Michael's yang. So whenever, Jordan would come down hard on someone like Burrell or Kerr or Wennington, Scottie was right there, helping these players along and, taking some of the heat for them. I mean, it wasn't just Jordan treating his teammates poorly. And I think Jordan did what he has to do in order to get results. He understood he can't boss around everyone like that because you didn't see him talking that way to Rodman. I mean, whenever Rodman will leave and go do what he needed to do, Jordan let him do it because Jordan knew that, Rodman was a crucial part of the team and he would show up every night when it was time to get down to business. Also, I think because Jordan knew he couldn't beat Rodman. But I think when it came down to it, him treating the role players like that, it was just to keep them prepared. There was one game in the playoffs I think we saw, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but Burrell had at least 20 points on excellent shooting, and the teammates almost dogpiled him on the sidelines in the playoffs. I mean, that's, again, Jordan keeping you ready for the moment, being hard on you, and making sure you're always ready and willing to step up into that spotlight. We saw it with him and Pippen being hard on Kukoc during the Olympics. All of a sudden, they're treating him like that. He's like, okay, I know what to do. I know how to adjust. Second time they played in the Olympics, he played even better. He comes to the States, and he evolves into a starter on multiple championship teams. So it all comes down to it, how you treat these players. You have to know who deserves what treatment and how to get the very best out of them. And him retaliating, or acting towards these players in a certain way, like when he got in the fight with Steve Kerr at practice. All of a sudden, Steve Kerr is in the playoffs hitting, big clinching jumpers. So again, Jordan treated his teammates this way in order to get the absolute very best results out of him. And his resume speaks for itself. At the end of the day, whatever works, works.
Yeah, I mean, I guess two things to quickly wrap this up. One, that personality, I think it works for him at the end of the day. You look at the resume, I mean, 6 finals, the MVPs, the Rookie of the Year award, all of that. I think, he's shown that his personality works. And it worked in that decade. Would it work now? Probably not, because you have players like, off the top of my head, I could think of like Patrick Beverly, like DeMarcus Cousins, players like that, maybe even Draymond Green, who probably wouldn't take that type of personality lightly, and they will try to bite back in a way, and that probably would hurt the chemistry of the team. But at the end of the day, it took the team understanding that this is Michael Jordan, this is how he plays, this is the passion that he brings to the game. He's not, there was one quote that was like, he's not asking us to do something that he's not doing. Jordan, he's in the gym, pushing weight, he's getting his shots up and doing all of that. And like times like that, especially with Jordan's resume, you need that. You need that type of leader. It's not always going to work when you have, that soft person or a softer leader. You're going to need somebody to be hard on you. And, they had that softer kind of person, which goes into how the team complemented each other. Scottie Pippen was, a little bit more of a team player than Michael Jordan. Not saying that Jordan wasn't a team player, but he wasn't as caring to everybody's feelings in a way that Scottie Pippen was. And another thing that stands out to me was when Jordan wasn't on the team, when he was playing baseball, and Scottie Pippen was the one leading the charge for the team. And then there was that final shot that Scottie Pippen wanted to take, but they didn't draw up the play for him, and Scottie Pippen sat on the bench. And then after that, they went into the locker room and started crying. I don't know why that part was so funny to me, but like in my mind, it's like you're in the playoffs. Scottie Pippen made one bad decision, and now you're crying in the locker room because of that. Like, I just thought that was funny. And I mean, overall, again, a great docuseries. And honestly, I wish I could live the life that Dennis Rodman played, because he was a man, on the court, like you said, Daly, he is giving you 110%, and his 110% is better than, a lot of people. And then when he's off the court, he's doing a whole bunch of things, that we could only imagine NBA players doing now. But again, he knew when to turn on that light switch, and when he turned it on, he was on. So transitioning out of The Last Dance, again, a great docu-series, to go into a little bit more recent news outside of the NBA. We're going to the NFL, with the NFL draft happening last month, and the first time that it ever happened, all virtual, again, due to the situation that we're in. But ultimately, teams still were able to select their players. You had Joe Burrow going number 1 overall, and a lot of those players like that. And I think for the most part, if you look at the local teams, the Giants and the Jets, they drafted pretty good. I think that it definitely could have been a little bit better, especially with the players on the board. But I think when you look at the rookies, especially in the earlier rounds that the Giants and the Jets were able to draft, I think, they'll be able to make an impact where, those teams could really be better in New York. Because let's face it, over the past couple of years, they've just been the laughingstock of the NFL, both the Giants and the Jets. So at least us in the area, we might not be 100% fans of them, but we still want them to succeed in order to make life in New Jersey and in New York a little bit better. And I think with the picks that they were able to get in this year's NFL draft, could help them, get to, a better position in the NFL.
I think both of these teams did a good job. The Giants, with that 4th overall pick, they had to go with a lineman. At least for me, maybe you could have picked Isaiah Simmons as a linebacker. I wouldn't have minded if they did that. But I'm also not upset that they picked Andrew Thomas. For me, I thought Andrew Thomas was the very best lineman in the entire draft. Tristan Wirfs, his name was thrown out there as a potential option for the Giants. But Andrew Thomas, you picked a guy who played in the SEC for the Georgia Bulldogs, arguably the best offensive lineman outside of Jonah Williams from Alabama. This guy, he stepped up in his last year at Georgia. He performed very well. And all the things that he did on tape, it showed. And he's also a guy that he's hungry, but I think he fits well into Joe Judge's system and to what Joe Judge wants. He's that type of player. And then looking at the other picks, Shane Lemieux out of Oregon, adding a guard to that line, I think will help as well. Will Shane Lemieux be able to play right away? I don't know, but I think with some grooming, he'll be all right. And a pick that I think will really help the Giants on defense is Xavier McKinney. To me, he reminds me a lot of Landon Collins because Landon Collins went to Alabama and he was drafted in the second round. And now you have a guy in Xavier McKinney, second round pick from Alabama. There's a lot of correlation there. And yes, Landon Collins, he's no longer on the Giants, but he did play well there for the few years that he was a Giant. And I think Xavier McKinney can be a good player. Transitioning to the Jets, Mekhi Becton, that was a pick that actually shocked me. I thought the Jets were going to go receiver, but they went with him. I think in terms of risk reward of all the linemen in the first round, Mekhi Becton probably had the biggest question mark on him, but just looking at his 40 time, it was remarkable. The way he was able to just blow everyone away. No one expected a guy who's 6'7", 360 pounds to run that fast. But just looking at the tape from what he was able to do at Louisville, it showed he is that talented. And then at wide receiver, Denzel Mims. That's a guy who I personally thought should have been drafted late first round. He slipped a lot, fell right into the Jets' lap. I think he will be a good fit because the Jets are a team. They no longer have Robbie Anderson. Sam Darnold needs someone to throw to. Denzel Mims out of Baylor is a good choice. I'm not upset at all with these two the draft classes for both the Giants and the Jets.
Yeah, I mean, the Giants, they knew they had to target offensive line early on. You know, you have to protect your quarterback, Daniel Jones, coming off of a solid rookie season. At the end of the day, protecting the quarterback is, a top priority. So getting Andrew Thomas, although I didn't think he was the best O-lineman in the draft, personally, I believe that to be Jedrick Wills. I think Andrew Thomas currently has the highest floor out of all the prospects. So although he might not reach the ceiling that, Mekhi Becton, would reach, I think Andrew Thomas right now, he didn't get beat a lot at Georgia. I think he can come in and be that bookend guy, especially, since the Nate Solder experiment didn't exactly work out for the Giants. Now, Xavier McKinney, like you mentioned, Daly, the last time the Giants had a dominant safety was Landon Collins, and they let him walk after a defensive player of the year caliber season. They refused to pay him, and they let him walk to the Redskins. Now they have another safety from Alabama, and I think McKinney, he probably should have went first round, but now they get a great talent in the second. He can come in, start from day one. Some other picks that I like for them, Matt Pert out of Connecticut and Darnay Holmes out of UCLA. Matt Pert, he silently rose up draft boards as the process went on. I think he's really solid. Maybe he can develop into a starter on that right side. Who knows? But he's definitely some great depth as a top 100 pick. And then Darnay Holmes, I really liked his tape playing in the Pac-12. Really tough quarterbacks in that conference. I think he held his own and he played really well. So to get him at pick 110, he's really solid. Giants cornerbacks, they don't have too many guys, there. So he could skyrocket up the depth chart and he could play his way into a starting role. Looking at the Jets draft picks, Mekhi Becton, like you said, Daly, from his combine, he just blew everyone out of the water. Like you said, really phenomenal athlete, great talent, super fast and super strong at his size. And then you look at some of his tape from Louisville, he's just throwing guys across the field. I mean, he's a mauler through and through, really just abusing opposing linemen, just getting them out of the paint. He's going to be phenomenal. Denzel Mims, he was a sleeper, and then he went and excelled at the Senior Bowl, and then all of a sudden he wasn't a sleeper anymore. I saw him getting mocked to the Steelers in the 4th and the 5th round, before the draft process, and then he had to go and tear it up there. So, now he's in New York. I think that's phenomenal. I think both of these teams did what they were supposed to do. They fortified their offensive lines, and, with the Jets especially, after you get someone that can block for Darnold and can open up these run lanes for Le'Veon Bell. Now you add in the 2nd round a huge weapon for Darnold, someone that can go up and get it, someone that performed at the Senior Bowl and now, has shown he can take on NFL defensive backs. So it'll be interesting for the Jets. Also, another pick I like, Ashton Davis from Cal in the 3rd round. I thought he was going to go a lot higher than he did. I personally had him, as one of the top safeties in the draft. So to fall to the 3rd round, his tape, it can be concerning at times, but there's no doubt he's talented. I think the Jets have 2 safeties in place already with Jamal Adams and Marcus May. But, with Jamal Adams' contract negotiations and possible trade in the works and Marcus May, although he showed he's got really great coverage skills last season, a little inconsistent. Ashton Davis could step in, maybe grab a starting spot. So both of these teams, they grabbed top-tier blue-chip O-linemen, and then they went with their next couple of picks and got some really great talents for the Giants. They filled that safety role. And then for the Jets, they got Sammy D, a great receiver, someone that can go get it and that can show he's a big weapon. Now, as far as how these teams will perform next season, it'll be interesting. Of course, AFC East, no Tom Brady. This is Darnold's 3rd season now. Last season, he had to deal with mono and other ailments, but he improved from his rookie season. So it'll be interesting to see how the Jets do. And then the Giants, on the other hand, the NFC East is always confusing to project. Of course, you've got Dallas and Philadelphia and the Redskins who added Chase Young, one of the best defensive ends I've ever seen. It's going to be a bloodbath in that conference for sure. But these teams they had really good drafts. They both got at least 3 to 5, instant players that can contribute from day one and can work their way into a starting role or already have that. So kudos to the Giants and Jets.
I guess just to wrap a bow on the NFL draft coverage, who do you think outside of the New York teams really won the NFL draft, like picked up the players that they needed and players that could probably start immediately or in the near future, probably between now and 3 years from now?
The team for me that really won the draft were the Cincinnati Bengals. Looking at this past year, obviously there's a reason why they were the number 1 team. They were not very good. I like what they were able to do. They improved a lot, obviously, with Joe Burrow, but 2 players that I think will really be key contributors on both offense and defense. T. Higgins at wide receiver. He's a guy that a lot of people thought could have been picked in the 1st round. Some people thought either Justin Jefferson or T. Higgins could have gone to the Eagles above Jalen Reagor, but instead Reagor went to the Eagles. And T. Higgins sliding to the 2nd round, 33rd overall pick, that was a great selection for the Cincinnati Bengals. He's a guy that I could see him and Joe Burrow meshing well together and kind of having a good connection, especially in both of their rookie seasons. And then on defense, Logan Wilson. He's a name that not a lot of people knew about because he's a Mountain West guy. The Mountain West, they're not known for defense, but most recently, the Dallas Cowboys out of Boise State 2 years ago, they drafted Leighton Vander Esch. Logan Wilson out of Wyoming, I think he could provide a lot of depth, maybe not in his rookie season, but I think as you talked about, Wilnir, year 2, year 3, I think he can be an X factor for the Cincinnati Bengals, and those 3 selections alone are why I think the Bengals won the draft.
Outside of the Giants and the Jets, the NFL team that in my opinion had, one of the better drafts, if not the best draft, and this pains me to say, but I'm gonna have to go with the Denver Broncos. I mean, shout out to Jory Mickens and Bob Toohey, Broncos fans on our sports staff. But this team, they didn't hit a home run on every pick, but the majority of their picks I really liked. I mean, in the first round, you get Jerry Jeudy at number 15. In my opinion, the top receiver out of the draft. Henry Ruggs went above him, but Jeudy, in my opinion, showed over the last 3 years at Alabama that he's a phenomenal talent. His route running ability, his run after catch ability. He's just a great player. KJ Hamler in the second round out of Penn State, just a speed threat, something that the Broncos really didn't have last season. So in the first 2 rounds, all of a sudden, you're giving Drew Lock, who went 4-1 last season as a rookie quarterback and played really solid, you're giving him two top tier wide receiver prospects to go along with players that he already has in Cortland Sutton, Philip Lindsay, and Melvin Gordon. And then in the third round, Michael Ojemudia out of Iowa. Wasn't a fan of that pick. I didn't really like his tape. It was very inconsistent, very up and down. I will say they reached on him for sure. But their next picks in the third round, Lloyd Cushenberry out of LSU and McTelvin Agim out of Arkansas. Lloyd Cushenberry, he was the linchpin. He was the cornerstone on the offensive line that won the Joe Moore Award, given to the best offensive line in college football. Lloyd Cushenberry, he wore number 18 at LSU, which, if you were unaware that, this is a standout player, just a role model in the locker room and a tremendous talent. And he shows that. And to grab him at number 83, I think he's going to be really pivotal on their offensive line, especially with the departure of Connor McGovern to the New York Jets. And then McTelvin Agim out of Arkansas, a really solid defensive tackle, just extremely disruptive. So to get him with their extra third-round pick from the 49ers, again, that's more D-line depth. All of a sudden, you've got a defensive line with Agim. You've got Bradley Chubb coming back from injury. You've got Von Miller, who's as dangerous as ever, rushing the passer. This team could be really scary. Some other picks that I like, Albert Okwuegbunam and Netane Muti in the 6th round. Okwuegbunam, I've been on his train for at least the last year or so. I mean, he's just dominant and he's fast and he's scary. And all of a sudden, the Broncos have just a ton of weapons on offense, and they're really making me nervous because they have everything you need, and they have a rookie quarterback that showed last season he can lead them, to wins. And then Muti in the 6th round out of Fresno State, he was really solid, run blocking and pass blocking. Again, getting offensive line depth, offensive line talent for their rookie quarterback. I think they knocked this draft out of the park. If they didn't pick Michael Ojemudia in the 3rd round, if they passed on him and took someone else, someone that I had higher on my board or that I like their tape more, this would easily be the best draft because just off the strength of Jeudy, Hamler, Cushenberry, Agim, Okwuegbunam, I mean, they excelled. It hurts me to say this, and the Steelers play them week 2, so I'm hoping the Broncos don't pull off the upset, but they were absolutely phenomenal on draft night.
Listen, honestly, you guys brought up two good teams, but I'm gonna have to go to another team in the AFC North, because I mean, you talk. Hold on. All right, hear me out. Right. So you guys talked about two teams that were kind of the bottom of the barrel in the NFL, and are gonna have to rework themselves and under a rebuild and trying to build themselves back up. But you look at a team that I think really won the draft, the Baltimore Ravens. This was a team that they were good over the past 2 years, but they just couldn't get over that hump in the playoffs. And they've focused a lot on their offense, and their offense has been helping them out over the past 2 years to get them to the playoffs. But we've seen against the Chargers last year, against the Titans this year, that sometimes the offense does stutter out a little bit, and they need that defense to really back them up. And in free agency and during the offseason, they made a couple of trades, got a couple of acquisitions, and in the draft, the fact that Patrick Queen dropped all the way down to them in 28, I mean, that was just honestly absurd to me. The fact that the Seahawks had the pick before them and went for an inside linebacker that wasn't Patrick Queen. I'm blanking on who specifically it was right now, but the fact that they went that they didn't go Patrick Queen and he was able to fall down for the Ravens. I think that overall is a solid pick for the Ravens where he could be plugged in and really help out the defense, because in years prior when the Ravens won the Super Bowl, it was their front seven that was really dominant. And their secondary, I mean, it helped them out too. Of course, Ed Reed in the secondary, but it wasn't as dominant as it is now, whereas the secondary, I feel like, is a strong suit of the Baltimore defense, and their front seven needed a lot of work. And it showed in that Titans game in the playoffs that the front seven needed a lot of work, because it seemed like time in, time out that Derrick Henry would just get to the second level. So you have Patrick Queen. You also get J.K. Dobbins, who fell down to the Ravens, and he's going to be a perfect fit for the Ravens because this is a team that's built for the run. This is a team offensively, they have running the ball, and it showed that they were able to break the NFL record for rushing yards in the season, but that's the way that their offense is built upon. Now, would you wanted to see the Ravens possibly get a receiver, maybe a bigger body receiver? Yes, but they did go receiver with the 92nd overall pick, and Devin Duvernay, and he's not a big body receiver. He's not going to be your jump ball receiver, but he has speed. And this is a Ravens team that is building themselves off of speed. And I think with those acquisitions, and then of course you have Matabuki, a defensive tackle to help out that front seven, and then you have a couple guards that were drafted in later on in the draft. I think this could help Baltimore get over that playoff hump next year, because they draft players for immediate success in Patrick Queen, even J.K. Dobbins, and of course Matabuki, who could probably get in 50%, maybe 40% of the defensive plays. And it's going to be exciting seeing those teams, the Broncos, the Bengals, and the Ravens, all play, NFL football soon. But, of course, you have to be focused on the current crisis that we're in right now with COVID-19. And it's slowly seeming like things are starting to open up a little bit. Of course, the NBA was the first major league to shut down, and then leagues started following suit. But now you have NBA practice facilities opening up around the nation, California, Florida, two states that come to mind right now. And it's seeming like the NBA really wants to restart this. Well, not restart, but start again this season, and possibly go into the playoffs and work from there. We haven't talked about this on WSOU, so I want to get your guys' opinions. Do you think that the NBA should restart, or should they just call this season quits and just focus on next season?
The NBA should come back. Here's why. Because they still have an opportunity to do so. I personally believe of all the sports that could come back, the NBA is probably the quickest, because they don't necessarily have money getting in the way or logistics. Now, obviously, logistics will be an issue, but I think it's easier to have a bunch of teams for basketball come together as opposed to baseball. I do know that Disney is an option for all of the teams to play and essentially have like a round-robin tournament to close out the regular season and then have the playoffs. That is on the table. I really like the way Adam Silver has done with conducting the return. There is a possibility that the season will not happen, but I think with the protocols and the measures that are happening with teams like the Rockets, they came back today. The Orlando Magic, they went back last week. Portland Trailblazers, as well as the Cleveland Cavaliers. Teams are slowly but surely starting to come back. Do not be surprised. And if a week or two, if the New York Knicks and the Brooklyn Nets come back, because Governor Andrew Cuomo, he talked about how sports are welcome in New York without fans, obviously, but they're welcome to return. LA, you have several teams out there. Don't be surprised if the Clippers and the Lakers, if they come back. I do think it's feasible for these teams in the NBA to come back. Obviously, testing has to be done every single day. You have to make sure that you're following CDC guidelines. Guys can't be going out to restaurants or things like that. They'll pretty much be holed up in hotel rooms. But I do definitely think that it is possible for the season to come back. Before I end here, one thing that this will have an effect on, not only will it have an effect on this season, but also next season, Next season probably won't be able to start until Christmas, especially if this goes into the late summer, early fall. You can't start in November. You'll probably have to start at the end of 2020, if not early 2021. And then what do you do for next season? Do you do a full 82-game slate, or do you have to cut it down to 50 or 40 games? That's in the air. But I do think that the 2019-2020 season will be closed out in the NBA.
Yeah, it's definitely it's definitely trending in that direction, I would say. Of course, you have all of these teams reopening their facilities. I saw a list of them. I believe it was about 16 or 17 teams. And the majority of those teams that were reopening their training facilities and getting their players back out there were playoff contending teams. I mean, you're posing the question, should the NBA come back? And for certain teams, of course, there's no point in it because, the record wasn't good enough or whatever. But you have a lot of these teams, the Bucks, the Clippers, the Lakers, the Raptors, that were at the top of their conference. So they don't want to pass out on a chance at an NBA championship. No one in their right mind is willingly giving that away. So if there's a way for sports to come back, then, we'll just have to wait and see. But Daly, like you said, a lot of these states, governors, they're publicly saying, we're willing to have sports in this setting. Gavin Newsom said it for California. Cuomo said it for New York and Arizona. I believe their governor said it as well. Same in Texas. These people are coming out and they're making their opinions known that as long as there are no fans and tests are being conducted on the players and everything is being, safe and sterile and everyone's following guidelines, then there's no reason not to. Now, of course, you look at other NBA seasons where they played, fewer than 82 games. Those were mostly lockout related, but they found a way to start and finish those in spite of the circumstances. So here, if whether or not it starts, with these teams finishing out the regular season games, or if they just go right into the playoffs, who knows? You've heard some players like Jared Dudley speak out about how they want the season to return and how they might play in Vegas or at Disney World. Fact of the matter is, there are facilities where these teams can go. There are facilities where these players can play. So, of course, having to test every NBA player, daily is going to be a struggle, and that's going to be a ton of resources. But this is a lot of revenue potentially being lost, and at the end of it, money is the root cause of a lot of these teams and these leagues' problems. So, who knows? But what we do know at this point in time, teams are starting to reopen practice facilities under certain rules. The players are going back. They're getting back to the swing of things. We've heard updates from the Players Association and the players themselves. Who knows? But we're working towards June, and that first week, those first 2 weeks of June, we could hear a ton of news, good or bad, on whether or not the NBA should return. In my opinion, as a fan, I would like to see the NBA return. You want the season to finish out. Of course, a ring would be crucial to a lot of these players' legacies and how they'll be remembered, whether it's Giannis winning his first or Harden and the Rockets pulling off an upset or LeBron winning his fourth and bringing a title to LA. You'd want the NBA season and the playoffs to resume. But, of course, in the grand scheme of things, if the season resumes and one player gets, COVID-19, at that point, we're right back at square one and the season's done with. At that point, it's finished because they were exposed to everyone, and you can connect it back throughout almost the rest of the league. So if you bring the season back, there has to be, you have to operate with an air of caution and one slip up, one mistake. If one player contracts it, whether they went to a restaurant or they didn't wash their hands or they came into contact with a service that had the virus lingering on it somehow, I don't know. But if one player gets it, all this, poof, gone, up in smoke. So it'll be interesting to see how, if the season comes back, how the players conduct themselves, and how things transpire. But we'll definitely be getting some more news on the situation in the upcoming weeks.
Listen, I think I agree with you, Heaven, in that second part that if something could happen, the whole season is just going to go up in flames, and it kind of ruins, a lot of things because, again, as a fan, of course you would want to see basketball. Of course you want to see these sports slowly coming back because, we've been out it for months and we saw, NASCAR starting to come back in and they're getting high views. We saw soccer coming back and they're getting high views. And I'm pretty sure if you start having major American sports, NFL, NBA, MLB start coming back, you're going to get high viewage too. But I think there's still not enough that's known about this virus. And I think to hope that one player off of a roster, like to hope that every single player off every single roster does the right thing, I think is a little too much to ask for. As much as it does pain me to say, and as much as I would love to see everything return, I genuinely think that the NBA should just cut this season. Now, of course, like you said, Heaven, you had teams that were going to the playoffs for the first time in a while. The Lakers, they were atop of the conference the first time, I believe, since 2014, 2015, if I remember correctly, or something around that range.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
That's the gist of it. It's been a while since the Lakers made the playoffs, and to now have them make it to the playoffs would also be a top seed. Of course, that's something that people are going to want to see. But I think there's just too much on the line, and there's too much to fix down the line if you do resume this season now versus if you just cut the losses and say we're going to just start back. Of course, there's a lot of decisions that come with that. Money, timing wise, sponsorships, partnerships, all of that. And I don't have any inside information on that. So if they need to, restart the season or start with the playoffs and they find it feasible and 100% feasible, then okay, go for it. But I think it's just too much to ask for this season to get played now and then possibly go late, and then now you're going to have to worry about next season and how next season is going to play out and having to put all those pieces together. I think just if you can, cut the losses, end the season, and just figure out how you can fix it up next year.
Honestly, I understand where you guys are coming from when it comes to if one player gets it, everything gets shut down, which is probably what it will be. But I do know that Adam Silver, he's been prepping for that worst case scenario. Because here's the thing. If you're going under the guise of if one player gets it, we have to shut down, then there's no point in starting a season because odds are someone is going to contract this virus if the season happens. There are just too many people in one area for it not to happen, unfortunately. I do think, though, if everyone's smart and social distancing will have to be important then more than ever if the NBA does come back, or even the NHL if they come back as well. Social distancing has to be important because you might not be able to have your whole team together at any given time if it's not game day. Game day, obviously, everyone will have to be together. But look, in the Bundesliga, you had the substitutes spread out in the stands. That's probably that will probably have to happen in the NBA. You'll probably have to have people sitting in the stands, and when it's their time to come down, they'll have to walk down onto the court. I could definitely see that happening. I do think, though, if someone does contract the virus, there is a possible way for them to come back. For me, I saw what the UFC was able to do. They were able to put up 3 cards in 8 days, and guess what? One of their fighters, Jacare Souza, he contracted the virus, but they were still able to get it. Now, granted, the UFC is different than the NBA. All they had to worry about was his corner, which is like 4 or 5 people, and then they were able to sequester them and get them away. When someone on an NBA team gets it, pretty much the entire team has to be on lockdown as a result. So there are different things, but I do think it is a possibility for the NBA to keep going even if someone contracts the virus, because Adam Silver is ready for that.
And I think that would about do it. I mean, we're going to have to just wait and see what does happen in the next couple of weeks because, again, anything could happen with the development and how governors are starting to feel about this coronavirus and about all of these social distancings and lockdowns and stuff like that. So we're going to have to see how everything does develop around the nation. But I think for our first Zoom sports talk, everything went pretty well. Wouldn't you guys say?
I would say so.
Yeah, this was interesting. Obviously very different from the previous editions of sports talk that we've had at the radio station. But I like this. This is fun.
And that only means that we're going to continue to give it to you and give you this sports talk with, of course, all of our other sports staff members at WSOU. But for Michael Daly and Heaven Hill, I don't know if I pointed at them correctly. Michael Daly and Heaven Hill. Yep, I did. I'm Wilnir Louis saying thank you for watching this, and make sure to follow our social media at WSOU Sports on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook to keep you up to date with anything that's happening around in the sports community. But again, thank you for watching and take care.
Oh my God, man! Not gonna sit